Over the past 2 decades, China's navy has grown from strength to strength, both in size and capabilities. It's become the second most powerful navy in the world, but it's ahead of the US in terms of number of ships, and that gap is increasing due to China's far greater shipbuilding capacity. However, in terms of raw power, the US still holds a significant lead, especially when it comes to its submarines and particularly its fleet of aircraft carriers. China's latest aircraft carrier, the Fujian, was meant to narrow the gap considerably. However, as recent reporting from a Chinese military blogger revealed, the Fujian has a fatal flaw that puts it at a serious disadvantage, even against US aircraft carriers half a century older than it. Let's take a closer look at the Fujian, its Achilles heel, and what it tells us about the naval arms race between the US and China going forward. To be sure, on paper, the Fujian is arguably the most advanced naval vessel yet fielded by the Chinese Navy. Some analysts might instead point to the Sichuan as the pinnacle of that country's naval innovation. This 850-foot-long vessel, launched in December 2024 at the Hudong shipyard just outside Shanghai, is an amphibious launching ship capable of transporting 1,000 Marines and ferrying them to shore by a combination of medium and heavy-lift helicopters and Type 726 Mustang hovercraft. But it's also a drone carrier fitted with electromagnetic aircraft launch catapults, or EMALs, capable of sending fixed-wing aircraft aloft, and 3 rows of arresting gear to safely recover them after flight. It's undoubtedly an innovative ship, and the US doesn't have anything comparable in its armada at this point. However, in terms of size, power and capabilities, the Fujian is a different scale of beast. In late September 2025, the Chinese Navy published footage of the 9th and final sea trials of the Fujian, demonstrating its ability to launch and recover aircraft from its first catapulted-equipped aircraft carrier. The footage shows new Chinese J-35 naval stealth fighters, J-15T carrier-based fighters, and KJ-600 airborne early warning and control aircraft being prepared for catapult launch, taking off, and then making arrested recoveries. The aircraft are also shown in flight, including in formation with a J-15D series electronic warfare aircraft, with the Fujian shown from above, with the 3 different types of aircraft arranged on its deck. The footage attracted widespread attention and praise from foreign media, with prominent US military journal The War Zone calling it a stunning leap forward and suggesting that revealing all 3 aircraft in action at once is something of a coup. Analyst Ben Lewis told USNI News, the news website of the US Naval Institute, that the Fujian's test was a significant milestone for the Chinese military's carrier program. The Chinese were, of course, quick to crow about the milestone as well. Chinese military affairs expert Zhang Jungxi stated that with the Fujian's latest breakthrough, China is becoming a major aircraft carrier power, with both the carrier and its aircraft achieving world-class in key metrics. Han Wei, a professor at the PLA's Naval Aviation University, added that the PLA Navy will also have greater confidence in safeguarding maritime rights and interests and carrying out missions on the far seas. On the face of it, it's easy to understand the enthusiasm. The only other aircraft carrier in the world to feature an EMAL system is the US Navy's flagship carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, which successfully tested its EMAL system back in 2022. However, the Ford, which as we'll see later in the video, is superior to the Fujian in many ways, yet has to date been unable to launch a stealth fighter jet with an EMAL system, like the Fujian has now demonstrated with the J-35. Indeed, as the War Zone points out, due to ongoing issues with the US's carrier-based F-35C version of its legendary 5th-generation fighter, it's unclear when exactly the Ford might be able to emulate the Fujian's feat. That's not only the impressive detail about the Fujian, which is China's 3rd aircraft carrier, the first carrier designed and built entirely domestically, and a large step up from its first 2. The first, the Liaoning, was launched in 2012. Originally an unfinished rusting hull acquired from a Ukrainian shipyard in 1998, it was finally completed at a shipyard in Dalian. China's second carrier, Shandong, launched in 2019, was built as a copy of Liaoning and demonstrated that China could build carriers on its own. Fujian, launched in 2022, proved China could not only build, but design carriers of its own. However, the two ships fall significantly behind their US peers, the US Navy's 10 Nimitz-class carriers, despite most of these being built decades earlier. The first of the class, USS Nimitz, was launched on May 13, 1972. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower followed the USS Nimitz in 1977, marking the second ship of the class. Next came the USS Carl Vinson in 1982, the USS Theodore Roosevelt in 1986, the USS Abraham Lincoln in 1989, the USS George Washington in 1992, the USS John C. Stennis in 1995, the USS Harry S. Truman in 1998, the USS Ronald Reagan in 2003, and finally the USS George H.W. Bush in 2009. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the first of the new class of Ford carriers that shares its name, was launched on October 11, 2013. Besides having almost 4 times as many aircraft carriers as China, the US fleet also had several distinct advantages over its Chinese analogues. The first big difference is in the propulsion systems. All of America's aircraft carriers are nuclear-powered, while the 2 Liaoning-class carriers are conventionally powered, utilizing oil-fired boilers and steam turbines for propulsion. The Liaoning is powered by steam turbines driven by 8 kVg4 boilers, while the Shandong uses a similar conventional propulsion system, derived from the Soviet-designed engines originally installed on the Liaoning. According to Matthew Funiole, a senior fellow in the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that means Nimitz carriers can operate for decades without refueling, while China's conventionally powered carriers need frequent refueling, limiting their range and endurance. A second major advantage that the Nimitz-class flat-tops hold over their Chinese peers is in their aircraft launch systems. As Funiole puts it, the Nimitz-class uses a steam-powered catapult system, also known as catobar, that allows aircraft to take off fully fueled and armed, maximizing their combat effectiveness. By contrast, Liaoning and Shandong rely on ski jump ramps, which restrict aircraft takeoff weight and drastically reduce their fuel and weapons load. This limits both the range and firepower of Chinese carrier-based aircraft. The Nimitz-class catobar system allows the ships to accelerate aircraft to over 250 km per hour, or about 155 miles per hour, meaning that the Reagan, for example, has a maximum takeoff weight of 45 tons, 60% more than the Shandong's 28 tons. The Chinese carriers also have only about 2/3 the displacement of a Nimitz carrier. The Liaoning and Shandong displace between 60,000 to 70,000 tons, with the Shandong slightly heavier than the Liaoning at approximately 66,000 to 70,000 tons. In comparison, the Nimitz-class carriers displace around 100,000 tons, a full load, making them significantly larger than both Chinese carriers. That limits how many aircraft they can embark, what kind of aircraft they can carry, and for how long they can support the aircraft in operations. For example, neither of the Chinese ships can carry a fixed-wing airborne early warning and control capability like the KJ-600 or equivalent US E-2 series of aircraft, and is compelled to use helicopters instead. The Nimitz-class carriers can also carry up to 60 aircraft in total, while the Chinese carriers appear to be able to field somewhere between 24 and 40. Nimitz-class carriers typically embark 4 squadrons of strike fighters, often 2 squadrons of 10 to 12 older FA-18C Hornet fighters, and 2 squadrons of the same number of FA-18EF Super Hornet fighters, amounting to 40 to 44 fighters in total. By contrast, Liaoning and Shandong can only be equipped with the aforementioned Shenyang J-15 strike fighter, China's sole carrier-based fixed-wing aircraft, and far fewer of them. What this all means is that while the US carriers can project power anywhere on the planet for extended periods, the Chinese carriers are limited to shorter operations much closer to home, likely within the so-called First Island chain. The chain stretches from the Japanese islands through the East China Sea to Taiwan, then along the eastern edge of the South China Sea to the Philippines and the island of Borneo. It's precisely these limitations in range and diversity of offensive options that the Fujian was intended to address. Estimated to displace 80,000 tons, it's believed to be the largest non-American warship ever built and the largest conventionally powered carrier in existence. It's also understood to be able to carry a fleet of about 50 aircraft, a 20 to 50% increase from the Liaoning and Shandong. And like the Ford, it launches aircraft using an EMAL system, rather than the ski jump-based systems on China's first two carriers, or the Katobar systems used by the Nimitz-class carriers. Electromagnetic catapults offer several advantages over both ski jump and steam-powered Katobar systems. EMALs are less mechanically complex than their predecessors, providing lower reset times that can help boost sortie generation rate. These systems can also be more finely tuned to very different aircraft types. That includes both larger and slower aircraft, like the KJ-600, which is too heavy for China's other two carriers, or smaller and lighter craft like smaller drones. The Chinese Navy is known to be working on advanced uncrewed combat air vehicles and other types of drones that can be launched from carriers and big-deck amphibious warfare ships like the Fujian. In the meantime, all three of the aircraft showcased taking off and landing in the aforementioned footage appear to have been, at least to a significant extent, specifically designed for use with the Fujian's EMAL system. The ability to launch the J-15T and J-35 fighters via EMALs will allow the planes to carry extra fuel loads and heavier payloads, increasing their range and offensive capabilities. However, the way these systems have been placed on the carrier's flight deck is precisely what puts the carrier at such a disadvantage, not only compared to the USS Gerald Ford, but compared to the US's oldest Nimitz-class carriers as well. This major design flaw was actually first noted by Chinese military bloggers and is based on officially disseminated Chinese footage. On August 5, state broadcaster CCTV aired a documentary entitled "Charge Toward First-Class Military Strength." In the program, a controller on the Fujian's flight deck control room explained how an aircraft landing on a diagonal runway moves through the number 1 and number 2 catapult lines to the opposite maintenance area. 6 weeks later, the Chinese military commentary platform Fujian cited this very scene to argue that simultaneous takeoffs and landings are a minimum requirement for large carriers, 80,000 to 100,000 ton class, yet the Fujian, despite being a large carrier, cannot perform them. The platform then presented graphics to show why this is so. The Fujian has 3 EMALS launchers on the deck. However, the number 2 catapult line overlaps with the end of the ship's diagonal landing runway, while the number 3 catapult is located within the landing strip itself. This effectively means that it's technically impossible to use the number 2 and number 3 launch lines at the same time as planes are landing. Although the number 1 catapult line doesn't overlap with the landing strip, landed aircraft must cross it to reach the maintenance area. The J-15 and J-35 are heavy aircraft that require significant runway length to stop. So what this crisscross flight deck arrangement means is that while landings are taking place, both the number 1 and number 2 launch lines are effectively unusable for launches. As Fujian explained, both of the catapults are situated close to the middle front section of the landing area. So either the J-15 or J-35 will roll over the catapults when they land, temporarily preventing them from being used for launch operations and thus affecting the takeoff efficiency of the fighter jets. According to Carl Schuster, a former US Navy captain who served on 2 US aircraft carriers, the angle at which the landing area crosses the Fujian's deck is only 6 degrees off center, compared with 9 degrees on the US carriers, limiting space between the landing strip and the forward 2 catapults. Additionally, the Fujian's landing area is longer than that of the Nimitz, meaning it extends too close to the bow area where aircraft are positioned for catapult-assisted launching. The longer landing area and the narrower deck angle reduce the space for repositioning the recovered aircraft, Schuster says. Schuster and the other US officer interviewed by CNN also noted that the forward catapults seem to be longer on the Fujian than on the Nimitz. That means that aircraft would be at greater risk of flight deck collisions as they move to and from elevators to the hangar deck below for takeoffs and landings. And according to the experts, the only option to mitigate this risk would be to reduce the pace of flight deck operations to try to prevent mishaps. What this all means, according to Schuster, is that the Fujian's operational capability is only about 60% that of the Nimitz class, including the US's two 50-year-old carriers, the USS Nimitz and the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. This reduced capacity could be a fatal flaw in combat operations against a US aircraft carrier. That's because a critical component of a carrier's combat power is its sortie rate, that is, the number of missions an aircraft can fly in a day. The Nimitz class averages 120 sorties daily, while the Ford class achieves 160 and up to 240 in emergencies. With one less catapult than the Ford, 3 versus 4, and one less aircraft elevator to lift planes onto the deck from the parking bays below, 2 versus 3, the Fujian is already at a disadvantage in how many aircraft it can get into the air quickly. More importantly, to sustain high sortie rates, carriers require flight decks designed for simultaneous operations, and the Fujian's flight deck issues mean that's largely not possible. In a direct engagement between the Fujian and even the oldest Nimitz-class carriers, the Nimitz-class flat top would be able to launch more aircraft more rapidly, which is likely to be a decisive advantage in the battle. Now, what caused the Chinese to make such a fatal design error? The Chinese military analysts who spotted the flaw attributed the issue to a last-minute switch from steam to electromagnetic catapults. Steam catapults require 230-foot launch strips, but electromagnetic systems need at least 328 feet, causing overlap with landing zones. South Korean military analysts Yunso Woo-dang suggests that the Chinese Navy decided to prioritize electromagnetic catapults to have the ability to deploy heavy aircraft like early warning planes, knowingly sacrificing simultaneous operations in the process. Being conventionally powered, the Fujian also suffers from the same disadvantages as China's earlier two carriers when compared to both the Nimitz and Ford-class nuclear-powered carriers. The nuclear-powered carriers can simply travel further and stay at sea for longer. That means, to compete with its US rivals effectively, the Fujian will need frequent refueling, making it more reliant on replenishment ships. That could also severely limit its operational capacity and scope, especially if experts like Funiole are correct, and the Fujian's smaller displacement means that the ship may not be able to store as much ammunition and fuel for its air wing compared to Ford in the first place. Sam Roggeveen, director of the Australian think tank Lowy Institute's International Security Programme, agrees, points to another glaring disadvantage that the Fujian, and indeed the rest of China's navy, faces compared to the US. China lacks the infrastructure to operate Fujian far from home for long periods. It has only a small fleet of replenishment ships of the kind that typically accompany a carrier fleet and keep it topped up with fuel, munitions and stores, he told Newsweek. Crucially, he added, China has nothing like America's vast global network of ports and bases where its carriers can be replenished and crews can rest. In addition to this expansive network of bases that China can't come close to matching, the US also has vastly more experience in operating aircraft carriers, especially in actual combat. The Nimitz-class carriers have been involved in major operations such as Operation Desert Storm in Iraq, where the USS Theodore Roosevelt completed over 4,200 sorties, the most of any carrier in the operation. The USS Enterprise was involved in operations in the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf region during the 1980s, including flight operations challenging Muammar Gaddafi's line of death in the Gulf of Sidra. And more recently, the USS Nimitz was deployed to the Western Pacific, then repositioned to the Indian Ocean amid rising tensions in the Middle East, particularly during the so-called 12-day war between Israel and Iran. By comparison, the Chinese carriers have precious little combat experience to call upon, and the Fujian likely still has some serious teething problems to overcome, especially with regard to its catapult launchers. As Lieutenant Commander Keith Stewart, a retired US naval aviator, told CNN, there's an old Navy proverb which states, all carrier operational rules and regulations are written in blood, which means somebody was either seriously injured or killed during flight ops. I've seen several folks killed on flight decks and know just how dangerous an arena it can be. Building a shiny new carrier is nice, but I would postulate that the Chinese don't know what they don't know about carrier ops. Now, mastering flight operations on an aircraft carrier and coaxing maximum performance out of both ship and aircraft takes plenty of often hair-raising experience in all kinds of conditions. And this is something that the Fujian's crew and onboard J-15 and J-35 pilots simply haven't had the opportunity to accumulate yet. Flying off a carrier in daylight and good weather is not too difficult. The hard part, and what makes flyers pucker their cheeks, is flying and landing on a nasty, rainy, windy night when the deck is wallowing up to 18 feet, you're low on fuel, and you're scared. If anybody tells you that they've never been scared during night ops, they're delusional, Stewart said. With an ambitious plan to roll out another 6 aircraft carriers by 2035, bringing it almost to parity with the US in terms of quantities, the Fujian is unlikely to remain the pinnacle of Chinese military shipbuilding for long. Indeed, a 4th Chinese carrier is in production, this time nuclear-powered, as all of China's future carriers are intended to be. If all goes according to plan, the new nuclear-powered carriers should be able to greatly close the gap on their US peers, especially in terms of their blue water capabilities. But for now, China's flagship carrier better hope it doesn't have to face off against a 50-year-old Nimitz class. We'll of course keep you updated as the situation develops, so make sure you've subscribed to the channel and enable notifications so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching.